So we start off with phonology, which, as we mentioned before, is the study of sounds. This will be a very quick subsystem. I think we'll get over it in quite a short period of time. The first one I wanted to go through is sounds in connected speeches. When we speak stuff out loud, we don't enunciate every single word. For example, if I'm going to say going to, I'm not going to say going to. That makes me sound robotic. The alternative when I speak is I mesh, I blend, I combine words. For example, instead of saying going to, for efficiency, I might say something like gonna in conversational speech. And especially if you see this in a written text, like a blog post, for example, you see someone write gonna, you can link it to register because you can link it to how it mimics the spoken mode, because this is something that happens in the spoken mode, right? And by doing that, it establishes a conversational tenor, which ultimately reduces the register of the text. So, of course, in connected speech, multiple things can happen. We can remove, we can reduce, we can disappear words, we can change words to make it sound more like neighboring words, and also we can make sounds appear where they aren't supposed to. Connected speech processes are basically essential for making us sound natural. If we don't have connected speech processes, we're just going to sound like robots, right? So let's go through each one of the connected speech processes. I use the acronym AEIV. That's assimilation, elision, insertion, and vowel reduction. The first one is assimilation. Assimilation, technically speaking, is when you sort of blend sounds together. So that's when one sound in a word becomes more like another. So an example might be, instead of saying handbag, you might say handbag, right? That often happens. We call this nasal assimilation. It's a specific type of assimilation. So the ND sound, which is hard to pronounce, we change that to an M sound. It's easy to pronounce. So that's assimilation. Another example might be, instead of saying footy, which is kind of hard to pronounce, we say footy or something like that, right? So, sorry. Instead of saying footy, you say footy, or instead of saying kitten, you say kitten. These two are examples of flapping or tapping. It's another type of assimilation. So this T sound, the T sound, which is hard to pronounce, we change that to a D sound, which is easy to pronounce. Another example might be something like 8-year-old. You might instead say it as H-year-old, right? The each-year-old. Instead of saying 8-year-old, you say 8-year-old. You're combining the TY sound, the TY sound, which is hard to pronounce, with the CH sound. So that's assimilation. The next one is elision. So elision is when you delete sounds, you remove a word or sound from speech. So for example, instead of saying going to, as I mentioned before, you might say something like gonna. Or instead of saying cup of tea, you might say cuppa. Right? This is when you remove sounds for ease and for speed of pronunciation. You can link it to fluency, you can link it to, if you see this in a written text, for example, you can link it to how it mimics the spoken mode, and thus you can link it to an informal register. In spoken conversation, it wouldn't be the most pertinent thing to point out because, like, that's a product. Like, using elision is a product of spoken speech. If it were a really formal text and you saw that, maybe you could point it out. But in like everyday conversation, if you see elision when someone says gonna instead of going to, really, I'm not sure if that is the most pertinent thing to talk about in terms of register. You still can, but look out for more interesting features. But in a written text especially, elision is a great feature to point out. We then have insertion. Insertion, as the name suggests, is when you add sounds where they don't belong. So an example is, instead of saying drawing, you might say draw ring. Or instead of saying humbling, you might say humbling. The E sound is added there, right? Or the R sound is added there. To be honest, I never analyze insertion, simply because if you imagine it from Vika's perspective, if they were transcribing a speech, a spoken speech, they're not going to write, like, instead of writing drawing, they're not going to intentionally put the R there. If they did, that's extremely low-hanging fruit. But normally, if you think about it logically, they wouldn't do something like this. It would be extremely dumb. So insertion, really, you never see it. Unless it's with something we call infixes, which we'll talk about later in morphology or lexicology, where instead of saying something like fantastic, you might say something like fan bloody-tastic. That's an insertion. Technically speaking, that's not actually an insertion, it's an infix. So nonetheless, point being, insertion very irrelevant. The last one is vowel reduction. Vowel reduction is kind of interesting. So vowel reduction is when you change a vowel sound at the end of a word into the ah in schwa. So for example, instead of saying paper, you might say paper, right? So instead of the er vowel sound, you change it to a ah in schwa. Or instead of saying you might say yeah, right? It's tough because it depends on the text, but it's interesting because this sort of feature, where instead of saying paper like Americans would, if you say paper, that's quite characteristic of the Aussie accent, of the the Aussie accent. So you could link it to identity, the Aussie identity. You can link it to registry even. You can link it to how it may aid a purpose by appearing more laid back and casual, right? You can link to multiple things. Whether vowel reduction, like saying you to ya, I'm not convinced that is a marker of Australian identity. That's more just a product of spoken speech. But if you see something like this, that would be more so reflecting the Australian identity. This one's more so just for fluency, rather than linking to identity. But yeah. So beyond that, we move on to prosodic features. Prosodic features are essentially, if you think about it, if you can take an exact same sentence and you can say it in different ways. So for example, you can say the same thing loudly, you can say the same thing softly, with stress, a bit quickly or a bit slowly as well, depending on what sort of effect you might want to achieve. Vika has been very specific, kindly, about what prosody is. They limit it to 5 features: SIP TV, stress, intonation, pitch, tempo, and volume. So if a question ever asks you in an SAQ, what are some prosodic features, you are limited to this. Do not pick anything else. Pauses are not prosodic features. Stick to this list, please. Okay, first one is stress. Stress is essentially the strength that you put on a specific syllable in a word. So you can say something louder, you can say something longer. Both of those enable you to stress that specific syllable, that word. A banal example might be something like this. If you put stress on the re and say research, that's a verb. Whereas if I say research and I put the emphasis on search, that's a noun. But that's really the banal example. You won't see that ever in a text. The more relevant example is when you see stress in a particular part of the sentence. So for example, random example, and you might put emphasis on the you. Why do you care? That achieves a certain effect, right? So you can ask yourself, by stressing and accentuating you, what effect? What are you trying to signal? What's the author trying to signal? What's the speaker trying to signal? What point are they trying to make? Those are questions you can ask yourself whenever you see stress. Next one is intonation and pitch. To be honest, pitch is irrelevant. If you want to be technical, pitch is the number of, or the speed of a vocal cord vibrations. If it's faster, it's higher pitch. Slower, it's lower pitch. But seriously, it has nothing to do with English language. Where it's more relevant is intonation. Intonation is variation of pitch. Don't be overwhelmed by that. Intonation comes in 2 types. One is rising intonation and falling intonation. Rising, falling, if that makes sense, right? So rising intonation, for example, can be used for multiple purposes. One of them is to what's called hold the floor. So if I'm still thinking of something to say and I want to tell the other person, don't interrupt me, I'm still thinking of something to say, I might use rising intonation to tell the other person to sort of, not interrupt me. So that's a good means to hold the floor. That's what it means. Another one might be if you're trying to ask a question. So I might say something like, this is a statement. So I can say either you go to school. That's a statement. Or I can say you go to school. That's a rising intonation, and that becomes a question. So if I use rising intonation, I can also use it to convert a statement into a question. I can also use it to signal uncertainty about something. So if I'm quite nervous, if I'm not sure about something, I might use rising intonation. Sorry. Yeah. Whereas falling intonation, it can be used to signal the end of a syntactic unit. So if I'm done speaking, I might use falling intonation, and it tells the other person, I'm done speaking, it's your turn to speak now. So it can pass the floor. I can also signal the end of the point, like I mentioned, and it can also show a sense of certainty, can show a sense of conviction as well. If you use it multiple times, yeah, uh, it can show your sense of authority, sense of conviction on a certain thing as well. Cool. The next one is tempo. So tempo is speed essentially. So you can say something fast or you can say something slow. If you use fast speech, that can be used for multiple things. One of them is if you're excited or you're nervous about something, you might use fast speech. As well as that, it's sometimes used for what's called a parenthetical aside. So when you want to that's add something to your speech or your point, but you don't want it to detract from your main point, you quickly add something. It's called a parenthetical aside, where you quickly add something without deviating from your main point, then return back to the main point. So that's also used for fast speech. Whereas slow speech, it can show a sense of calmness, sense of deliberation, sense of reflection, sense of calmness, confidence, composure. It can also perform a very similar role to emphasis. So you can ask yourself, like, what are they trying to do by slowing down, really slowing down here, and trying to highlight that certain point? What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to signal? What point are they trying to convey to me? Those would be questions you can ask yourself if you see slow speech as well. Last one is volume. I hope I don't need to explain volume. You can say the same thing loudly or softly. Soft voice can show a sense of calmness. It can be very soothing, empathetic. It can show a sense of uh, sincerity and care. Soft volume can also be used for dramatism, for suspense as well. You could also, yeah, yeah, for dramatism and suspense. And for loud volume, it could be used if you're trying to show a sense of frustration, anger, if you're trying to establish authority. It can also be used if you're expressing surprise. One other place where loud volume might be used is if, say, one person is talking and you really hate what the other person is saying, you really want to interject. Use loud volume to overlap what they're saying and get the floor, like stop them from speaking and allow you to speak. You might use loud volume to interrupt them. So that's the prosodic features in a nutshell. We move on to phonological patterning. So phonological patterning is essentially when you repeat sounds for a certain effect, right? These are stylistic effects, so they create some sort of memorability, creativity, some sort of emotional engagement in communication. My recommendation whenever you talk about phonological patterns is you mention what phoneme is being repeated, what sound is being repeated. So, for example, alliteration in this nursery, tongue riddle, whatever they're called, this thing, which repeats the phoneme P, right? Always do this whenever you talk about phonological patterning. So assonance, which repeats the certain phoneme, consonant phoneme, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, for consonants. And for assonance, repeats the certain vowel phoneme, blah, 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 right? So that will show a bit more nuance in your analysis. Once again, VK is very specific in terms of what you can analyze. It's the acronym this time is RACORA: rhyme, alliteration, consonants, onomatopoeia, rhythm, and assonance. So we have rhyme. So rhyme is when you repeat words with same vowel or consonant ending. So for example, in my psych class, I was taught fight or flight. You could assume why they did that. It's a very good mnemonic. It's a good means to enhance memorability, to like grab your attention, and it serves as a very good mnemonic device. Yeah. It's also used oftentimes in slogans for that reason, to make it more memorable as well. I can also draw your attention to that specific part of the text, and again, you could ask yourself why they're trying to do that. Rhyming is often seen in Aussie slang. So, for example, instead of saying sauce, you might say dead horse. Sorry, yeah, dead horse. Instead of saying road, you might say frog and toad. Right, so it's very common in Aussie slang. Cool. Alliteration. Alliteration is when you repeat the initial consonant or vowel sound at the beginning of a word, which is close to each other. So, for example, you might say Peter Piper picked a pepper of pickled peppers, which is what I put here. It makes it memorable and engaging. It adds that rhythmic quality. It's often used in tongue twisters, nursery rhymes for that reason. It's also very memorable because of that rhythmic quality that it has. It makes it more engaging and interesting to listen to. Alliteration can also draw the listener's or reader's attention to that specific phrase, which again, you can ask yourself of why they're trying to do that, what they're trying to signal, what point they're trying to make, and you can relate this to one of the contextual factors. But yeah, you'd often see alliteration in marketing because it's a good means to make something more catchy, make something memorable. So yeah. Next one is consonants, and let me be honest, consonants and assonants, I can't even remember a single time I analyzed it in an AC or an SAQ, so really forget about it. But consonants is when you repeat the consonant sounds within or at the end of the word. For example, pitter, patter. Again, it adds that rhythmic quality. It creates a nice sense of texture. It gives it rhythm to the text. So that's consonants, where you repeat the consonant sounds. I'll do assonants then. Assonance is when you repeat vowel sounds. So you might say hot dog. That's an example of assonance. The O sound is being repeated. Again, it creates the internal rhyme, the flow, the texture to the text. But once again, never analyzed it. I don't even recall a single instance I analyzed it, so that's fine. Next one is onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is essentially when the words that sound like what they're describing. So for example, smack, bang, meow, right? And because, when you're writing, obviously you can only describe, most of the time you only describe what's visually around you, like you add adjectives to sort of describe what's spatially around you. But by using onomatopoeic phrases like smack and bang, you're adding a second sense, you're adding the hearing sense, right? So it creates that sense of vividness, that sense of realism to the descriptions that authors or speakers are making. And it really is used in storytelling to help paint a picture of what was in the reader's mind when they wrote that thing. So onomatopoeia is a very good stylistic feature. Last one is rhythm. To be honest, rhythm, again, you don't look at a sentence and say, oh, it's because of this that causes a rhythm. Most of the time, you point at another feature and say, oh, that has a rhythmic quality. So you don't use rhythm in the strict sense of, it's because of this word that it has rhythm, but rather because it is alliteration, thus it has a sense of rhythm and texture to the text, right? So rhythm in and of itself, you don't really analyze. But ultimately it creates this flow, it creates this musicality, it's very good for poetic function. And there's not really an example for this because you can't really, again, there's no sentence that you point at and say that has rhythm. You say it has rhythm because of something else, such as rhyme or alliteration, etc. So the key word for this is rhythmic quality. Cool. We move on then to vocal effects. Vocal effects are essentially non-lexical in nature, and they convey a certain mood and emotion and attitude to something. There are three vocal effects: cough, laughter, and breath. Cough, hopefully I don't need to give a definition of this, but cough can be used, to be honest, I rarely see this, but it can be used if you're trying to make a point, you're trying to tell a joke. It can show a sense of nervousness, discomfort, anxiety towards something. But yeah, I rarely analyze cough, to be honest. We'll do breath next. Breath is essentially when, say you want to express surprise at something, if you want to express shock at something, relief at something. It can show a sense of difficulty. If you have trouble talking about a certain topic, you might use a lot of intakes of breath. If you're trying to show suspense as well, you might take in a breath. Another place where breath might be relevant is with topic shifts. So say, for example, you're on topic 1, you're talking about topic 1, and instead of suddenly moving to topic 2, so topic 1, blah, 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 topic 2, blah, 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 you do topic 1, blah, 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 topic 2, blah, 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 blah. It shows you're shifting between topics, that you're done with the first idea and you're moving on to the next. So it's a good means to signal topic changes. But yeah. The third one is laughter. Laughter, again, hopefully I don't need a definition for this, but laughter, it shows, if someone's talking and they make a joke and you laugh at it, it shows your enjoyment, it shows humor, it shows solidarity, right? So it's a good means to build rapport and reinforce a bond that someone has. It's also a great reflection on the rapport, on the relationship, on the tenor between those participants as well. So there's so many things you can link to if you see laughter in a text. Very good feature. Then we see regional accents. This is largely a part of the course which has died down, less relevant than it was previously, but still is in the study design. So we see global variation in English, for example. We see Canadian English, Chinese English, Indian English, American, Australian English, New Zealandic English, Singaporean English, right? We see global variation in English, but interestingly as well, although it's becoming less of a trend now, it used to be that we had very diverse regional accents as well. Like we saw different ways of speaking between people. People could sound really posh, but at the other end, they could sound really ochre, like Steve Irwin type of stuff, right? And so we characterize it into 3 different accents: the broad, the general, and the cultivated accent. We start off with the broad accent, which is the most distinctive Aussie accent. You think about any Aussie, you're thinking about, like if you think about a stereotypical Aussie, you're thinking about a broad accent. It's got, elision, assimilation, like things like instead of saying Australian, you say Australian. Diphthongs, like instead of saying today, you say to die. Instead of saying give us, you might say gizza, right? Things like that. People like Pauline Hanson, she speaks in a broad Australian accent. Steve Irwin speaks in a broad Australian accent. And yeah. Yeah. Next one is going to be the cultivated accent on the other side of that. So the broad Australian accent has connotations of informality, laid back, and friendliness, but sometimes it can be seen as very bogan, very sort of, what is it, like sometimes irresponsible, sometimes too unprofessional, too relaxed. It's sometimes known as slovenly, a bit lazy as well. So it has some negative connotations. And of course, at the very opposite spectrum or side of that is the cultivated accent. It's modeled after what's called the British RP, the British Received Pronunciation. It's a very posh accent. Like you listen to the Queen talks in a very cultivated accent, and it's linked to high social class, high education. But nowadays, if someone comes to you speaking in a really posh accent like that, most of the time people are going to think you're pretty pretentious. So yeah, it can make you sound like you're professional, educated, but at the same time, it can make you sound unfriendly, cold, distant as well. So as a middle ground between those two, the accent that I probably use as well, given that I believe something along the lines of 80 to 85% of the population speak this accent, is the general accent. It's a middle ground between the sort of ochre boganness of the broad Australian accent and the poshness of the cultivated accent. Yeah, and it's basically a neutral accent, and it basically embodies the pros and cons of it's the balance between the pros and cons of the broad and the Australian accent. And you would notice that media representation in legacy media, we see a lot of used to be that we had a lot of cultivated accents, such as James Dibble from decades ago. By now, he had a very cultivated accent. He used to be the sort of like classic person that we saw in legacy media, but that's slowly dying down. We're starting to see more general accent popping up instead in legacy media, because it's sort of this bastion of neutrality that makes you seem like you're not biased towards one side. Yeah, makes you appear neutral, which is of course what news agencies want. So those are the 3 accents. We then have 2 more features to go through before we finish up on phonology. We have diphthongs. Diphthongs are when you change one vowel sound into 2, very classically Aussie. So instead of saying right, you might say right. Instead of saying mate, you might say might. That's a very classic Broad Australian accent feature. If you see this in a text, please, for the love of God, analyze it because it is such low-hanging fruit. Vika, instead of writing right, they went through the effort. The examiners looked at or heard the speech and they were like, when I transcribe this, instead of writing right, I'm going to spend extra times putting my fingers to the O and the I. They intentionally did that. If you do not analyze that, and that is the biggest low-hanging fruit, you'd be dumb. Sorry, you'd be dumb if you don't analyze this. So if you see this in text, please analyze it. You can link to so many things such as identity, prestige, register, among anything else that is pertinent to the context. Next one, or last one for phonology, is elongated vowel sounds. As the name suggests, that's when you lengthen a vowel sound in speech. So for example, you might say something took far too long. This can have various effects. One of them is, in the case of the example, it emphasizes the severity, the length, the nature of something. But as well, in spontaneous conversation, you also might notice this, and that's because if you're not sure what to say next, and you want to hold the floor or tell the other person, don't interrupt me, I'm still thinking, you use elongated vowel sounds as a means to plan what comes next and to construct the rest of your sentence. So you see elongated vowel sounds as a planning tool as well. And so it's a hallmark of spoken and spontaneous conversations. And yeah, that's it for phonology.